It's no secret that the United States feels more divided than it has in recent memory. From the streets of LA to courtrooms and town halls around the country, political tensions are at historic highs. Some of those tensions are purely political, but many more are deeply personal, like abortion, gun rights, race, and gender identity. On the news, we see confrontation and, in some cases, outright violence. It's not uncommon for people to feel deeply uneasy and worried about the stability and future of the country. With new technologies and wars erupting throughout the world, it's easy for people to believe that this is a uniquely unstable time. However, America has been here before. The USA was once so divided that the elevated political debates in Congress at the time descended into violence. Mobs roamed the nation's cities and towns looking for enemies. Mob rule reigned, and political bloodshed was common, many years before the first shots of the Civil War were fired. In Marais de Cygnes, Kansas in 1858, 5 abolitionist free staters, people who wanted new U.S. states to be free, were kidnapped and gunned down in cold blood. 5 others were wounded but survived. The death toll in Kansas in the years before the Civil War was anywhere between 55 and 200, with some historians believing it was higher. In the mid-19th century, one issue stood above all the others: slavery. No group of people outside the plantations and work farms of the South faced more violence and organized hostility than the abolitionists, the men and women who were determined to abolish slavery in the United States forever. Welcome to a day in history. Today, we remember a time when political violence was a regular occurrence in the United States. Violence against the abolitionists, the men and women working, fighting, and sometimes dying to rid the United States of slavery in every corner of the country. In the second half of the 1800s, speaking out against slavery could cost you your livelihood or your life. Abolitionists were white and black, and both took their lives in their hands when they wrote, spoke, and marched through the streets of the country, protesting what many historians still call America's original sin. Let's get one thing clear. Most Americans in the North didn't think too much about slavery. By the 1850s, slavery had existed in what was to become the United States for 2 centuries. Most people accepted it as a necessary evil. In the South, it was believed that several things would happen if slavery were ever abolished there. First, the economy would fall apart. Higher labor costs would mean that many slave owners would go broke. Second, freed slaves would want revenge and a bloody racial war would ensue. Third, racial mixing would occur, including what many white Southerners thought to be the ultimate sin: mixed-race children and much more. But most abolitionists didn't dare set foot south of the Mason-Dixon line, which marked the boundary between the North and the South, and a slave state from a free state. In actuality, some states would later fight for the Union were slave states: Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri, though large numbers of men from both states fought for the Confederacy too. Getting off a train from Boston or Philadelphia and Atlanta and starting to preach about the evils of slavery was a good way to get a free round ticket back north, probably with a black eye, and that's if you were lucky. However, most abolitionists were content to work, write, march, and petition their state and federal governments from the relative safety of their homes in the North. In truth, many people in the North did not like the abolitionists much either. Many of the abolitionists belonged to small but vocal religious sects, and these sects were often unpopular in other parts of the country. Quakers, most of whom hailed from Pennsylvania and New Jersey, were especially disliked. But Methodists, Congregationalists, and even members of the new evangelical movement that sprang up in the early part of the 1800s and who would morph into the Southern Baptists in the later 1800s were singled out for criticism, vandalism, and violence. It may come as a surprise to many Americans today, but not everyone in the North was in favor of abolishing slavery. Of course, there were those whose hatred and disdain for black people led them to the conclusion that slavery was a necessary evil. Others believed that interfering with the American economy on such a grand scale would lead to an economic collapse that would take years to recover from. And still others represented most of the northern population. They were for a unified country, and the question of slavery was threatening that union. To us in 2025, it may seem an easy question. Slavery should be a thing of the past, and everyone back then should have recognized it. To better understand how people related to slavery, let's take a look back at a more recent example in American history: abortion rights. Though abortion rights and slavery have little in common, they do engender deep-seated moral beliefs on both sides. And like in the 1800s, the abortion issue has led to violence. The deadliest single anti-abortion attack in U.S. history happened in 2015 when a gunman killed 3 people and wounded 9 at a Planned Parenthood clinic in Colorado Springs. This was just an isolated event, just the most lethal in a series of shootings, bombings, and targeted killings going back decades. Abortion rights and slavery are very different issues. Still, the pattern is the same. When political and moral absolutes collide, and people see any compromise as a betrayal of their cause, violence is often not far behind. The violence against the abolitionists in the 1800s and abortion clinics and doctors in the 20th and 21st centuries is a reminder that political polarization, certainty, and moral conviction can carry a very high price. When we think about violence against abolitionists, it's easy to picture angry Southern mobs or plantation owners lashing out at Northern invaders who didn't know how things are in the South. However, the truth is more complicated and reveals a great deal about pre-Civil War America. Much of the violence aimed at abolitionists in the years preceding the Civil War didn't originate from the South. It came from their neighbors in the North. Except New England, whose colonies, then states, had abolished slavery long ago and which had a long-standing, though small, free black population. But in industrial northern cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Cincinnati, where there were thriving abolitionist circles, there were also angry crowds who saw those same reformers as radicals threatening the Union, the economy, and white supremacy. And these weren't just street brawlers or drunks, they were merchants, clergymen, editors, public officials, and more. They were fighting to preserve slavery for slavery's sake, but they were fighting to maintain the status quo, a status quo where slavery was someone else's problem, until the liberated slave population moved north. Many people knew about the draft riots in New York City in 1863, and the possibly hundreds of deaths that resulted when mobs of Irish immigrants and others protesting the new draft law began attacking black people on the streets of New York. Still, almost 30 years before that, in 1834, days of rioting broke out when a rumor spread that abolitionists were gathering secretly to promote interracial marriage. Lewis Tappan, a prominent abolitionist, was ransacked. No one was ever charged. Black churches were destroyed, and several homes burned to the ground. The following year in Boston, a mob tried to hang the country's most prominent abolitionist, William Lloyd Garrison. They dragged him down the street with a rope around his neck and were only stopped when police grabbed Garrison and locked him in a jail cell overnight for protection. That same year, in the small upstate New York city of Utica, the mayor led a mob to break up an anti-slavery meeting. Perhaps the most famous instance of mob violence happened in Illinois in 1837 when Elijah Lovejoy, a minister and publisher of an abolitionist paper, was shot and killed as he attempted to defend himself and the new printing press he had just ordered, and which the mob was trying to destroy. It was the fourth one he had had to buy. Before his death, Lovejoy lived in St. Louis and had had the prior 3 printing presses destroyed by mobs. Lovejoy's death became a rallying cry for abolitionists throughout the country and drew more people to the movement. At the same time, Lovejoy's death was a warning. Speak out, and you might die for it. The incident is featured in an episode of Ken Burns' famous series, The Civil War. So why were people in the North, the free section of the country, so hostile to the very people who were calling out slavery as a sin? Easy. Money and politics. Northern banks financed many, if not most, of the extensive southern plantations. Northern mills relied on cotton, which was grown by slaves. Northern shipping industries depended on the very same trade routes that transferred slaves from Africa to the West. Many Northerners were uncomfortable with slavery, and many were against it. But they were also against economic hardship, which is what many of them feared would happen if slavery were ended in the South. A smaller and more radical minority feared the chaos that emancipation could bring. They worried that the abolitionists would spark a war, or that freed black people would flood the North with cheap labor and disrupt not only the economic order, but the racial order as well. Some Northerners opposed slavery but didn't want black neighbors, black workers, and especially not black voters. Even in the North, abolitionists were labeled as traitors, inciting insurrection and wanting to tear the country apart. William Lloyd Garrison, the man almost hanged by the mob in Boston, firmly believed that the United States was rooted in an evil system and that the Constitution, which barely spoke of slavery, was a covenant with death, and urged the North to secede from its own free country. Moderate people throughout the country were terrified of Garrison and his supporters. Of course, Garrison was the most radical of the radicals, but in many places, abolitionists were not the moral heroes they are today. They were traitors to their country and their race. American students learn most about the Civil War in high school, and most are surprised to learn that before the actual Civil War broke out, a civil war had already occurred in Kansas. After the passage of the 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act had opened the territory to popular sovereignty, letting settlers vote on whether to allow slavery, the territory became a battleground. Abolitionist settlers clashed with the fancifully named pro-slavery Border Ruffians of Missouri. Towns were burned and people were executed in front of their families. In 1856, pro-slavery forces sacked the free town of Lawrence, Kansas. Though no one was killed, the city was essentially burned to the ground and marked the beginning of an entire series of tit-for-tat attacks that made people throughout the country believe that a large-scale civil war was not only possible, but probable. In response to the attack on Lawrence, a truly fanatical and frightening figure emerged onto the national scene: John Brown, who would later lead the famous attack on the Weapons Depot at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in the hopes of starting a slave revolt, seized and killed 5 pro-slavery settlers with a sword. Anti-abolitionists pointed to Brown as the kind of fanatic that was tearing the country apart. Some abolitionists and others who had been inspired by Brown's actions to join the anti-slavery cause finally decided that only conflict would rid the country of slavery. When people believe they are right, especially if they think they have God on their side, they are capable of doing monstrous things. Hacking 5 settlers to death is a monstrous thing, and many people, especially Brown, thought he was doing the Lord's work. In 1858, the 5 Free State settlers mentioned at the start of this video were killed by pro-slavery militants. In Kansas, a large, wild, and unsettled state at the time with little law enforcement, many more deaths likely occurred than the 55 to 200 often mentioned. Some people simply disappeared. One reason for the excessive violence in this era is that both sides believed they were entirely correct, not only politically, but morally and even biblically right. Abolitionists pointed to the message of Jesus and the idea that all souls are equal before God. Pro-slavery forces pointed to Old Testament passages and the social hierarchies described within that had been, in their opinion and belief, ordained by God. And of course, if you were right and on God's side, what did that make your enemy? A liar? A heretic? And a threat to order, the scripture, and the future? Many pro-slave people truly believed that abolition was satanic. Many, if not all, abolitionists believed the same thing about slavery. The struggle in the U.S. before the Civil War wasn't just economic and political, it was spiritual. The middle 19th century was a time of significant change in the United States and Europe. The biggest changes were taking place every day in factories and inventors' workshops throughout the Western world, and one of them, photography, was changing not only how we saw ourselves, but for the first time, allowed people to see exactly what life was like far away. One of the most famous pictures of the time is of an escaped enslaved man named Gordon, who escaped a plantation in Mississippi in 1863. His back was covered in scars from being whipped. There was more scar tissue than normal skin on Gordon's back, and he was not alone. Abolitionists seized upon the new medium to convey their message. Soon, pictures of men, women, and children who had escaped slavery, along with their internal and external scars, were being printed in newspapers and books throughout the North. These images, coupled with the publication of the famous 1852 novel Uncle Tom's Cabin, which gave many readers their first real exposure to slavery, went a long way in moving popular opinion towards an anti-slavery position. Traveling to the South with abolitionist papers, books, or pamphlets was a grave mistake, however. Though the mid-1800s was still a time when most people did not travel much further than 20 miles from home, There were many people, especially among the wealthy in the North, who had relatives in the South, and visits did occur, as did business trips. It was well known that in virtually every state in the South, abolitionist papers and tracts were illegal, and worse, dispensing them to groups in the South itself, especially to slaves, could easily get a person hung, and, at the very least, beaten badly. In 1835, Amos Dresser, a New Hampshire abolitionist, was traveling through Nashville. Dresser was found to be in possession of abolitionist literature and was tried, not by a judge, but by a mob of vigilantes. He was sentenced to 20 lashes with a whip, which happened in the main square of the then small city. Traveling south on a train or ship, any northern traveler who expressed sympathy for enslaved people or promoted abolishing slavery was at risk of harassment or violence. Some anti-abolitionists, especially in border states like Maryland and cities like Baltimore, checked hotel registers for northerners, especially from New England. Letters were intercepted and read. In some places, just being a northerner was enough to arouse suspicion. Throughout the South in the years before the Civil War, agitators against slavery were hung, and many were forcibly put on trains and ships with a one-way ticket home. Not all abolitionists were the same. Some, like Garrison, promoted the destruction of not only slavery, but a complete rebuilding of the country from the ground up. Others hoped that quiet persuasion would eventually end slavery without violence. And as 1860 approached, still others were forced to acknowledge that perhaps only war would erase slavery from American life. But no matter how they fought for their cause, with a camera, printing press, a vote, they faced consequences that today seem unimaginable. Hopefully.